The train screamed against its own iron weight as it slowed, steel grinding on steel until sparks flashed along the track. Steam billowed upward, white plumes vanishing into the dry September air. Dust swirled across the platform, stinging eyes and settling into the creases of coats and shawls. Margaret stood among it, clutching a satchel worn from travel. Her gloved fingers pressed so tightly against the handle that her knuckles had gone white. Inside the bag lay the only thing of beauty she still possessed, a folded wedding dress she had never worn. Its lace had yellowed with time, a relic of vows once spoken and buried along with the man who had made them. She had not meant to step down here. The ticket, the letters, the promises they had belonged to another town, farther down the line. Yet fate, or perhaps cruel coincidence, had left her stranded in this place whose name she had never heard until that morning. She lifted her chin against the wind, refusing to let the townsfolk see her falter. Though her chest ached with the familiar sting of being unwanted, the platform was lined with faces that neither welcomed nor mocked, just studied her. A woman in a patched bonnet nudged her neighbor, whispering. A boy spat in the dust. Margaret, her black shawl clinging to her shoulders, felt as though the very earth beneath the wooden planks judged her presence. She was too proud, too tired, too marked by sorrow, to pass as someone fresh with hope. Beyond the crowd, leaning in the shadow of a post, stood a man. His hat brim was pulled low, but she saw the scar cutting across his cheek when the sunlight caught it. His shoulders were broad, his clothes simple, but worn with honest labor. At his side clung a small girl, no older than 8, her hair braided in 2 neat strands that swung with each fidgeting movement. The girl's eyes fixed on Margaret, wide and searching. Margaret shifted her satchel, ready to retreat into the uncertain road beyond town, when the child tugged at the man's sleeve. Her voice was soft, nearly lost beneath the hiss of the engine cooling, but Margaret caught it. "Papa, our prayers have finally been heard." The words struck her with unexpected force. They cracked the shell she had built during miles of train tracks and empty nights. She wanted to turn away, yet her boots seemed rooted to the planks. The man, Thomas, as she would later learn, did not soften. His jaw tightened. His eyes measured her as one might a stranger, asking for shelter when there was little to spare. He offered neither smile nor hand, only a curt nod that carried both reluctance and responsibility. In that gesture, Margaret recognized a man who had known loss and built walls so high he could not see beyond them. "I've room at the ranch for a night or 2, he said finally, his voice roughened like wood left too long in the sun. "Until you find your way." It was not welcome, not kindness. It was duty, spoken without warmth. Yet to Margaret, who had braced herself to be left standing alone at this wrong station, it was a threat of reprieve. She inclined her head, silent, knowing that words might betray the tremor in her voice. As they walked away from the platform, the girl skipped once, though her father's hand restrained her joy. Margaret caught the faintest smile on that young face, a child's belief that prayers, whispered into the dark, sometimes took flesh and bone. She envied such faith. The dust rose behind them, swallowing the station and its watching eyes. Margaret followed the man and his daughter into the wide, unyielding land, her satchel heavy with the past, her heart heavier still. She felt no belonging here, no promise of shelter, and yet, in the echo of the child's whisper, a fragile seed of hope began to stir, as if the long, merciless road of her life had not yet ended, but paused to open upon some uncertain turning. The ranch lay several miles from the station, a low house of weathered timber crouched against the open prairie. When Margaret first stepped through the doorway, she felt the weight of silence settle over her, like an old quilt left in a trunk dense, heavy with years of dust and memory. Thomas gave no explanation, only a brief tour, as though the house itself could speak for him. The hearth was dark when she arrived, but beside it stood a rocking chair of polished oak. It was the only piece of furniture untouched by wear, gleaming faintly as if hands still smoothed its arms each night. No one sat in it. Margaret sensed it belonged to someone whose absence was a wound rather than a memory. Above the mantel hung a rifle, oiled and polished, though the faint spiderweb of dust around its barrel suggested it was rarely fired. The hearth, the rifle, the cherich, seemed a monument to something lost. In the barn, she found old tools rusting on their hooks, their handles warped by rain, a scythe blade dulled, a plow missing a wheel. They spoke of a life interrupted, chores left undone when sorrow stole the strength to finish them. She touched a rusted hammer, feeling the grit crumble beneath her fingers, and wondered if her own life was destined to rust unfinished. The girl, however, refused to let the house drown entirely in its silence. In small, unpracticed ways, she wove Margaret into her days. She appeared by the hearth one evening with a comb and ribbon, asking to braid Margaret's hair. Margaret bent her head, and for the first time in years, felt the tenderness of hands working through her braid, strand by strand. Another morning, when Margaret woke, she found a small bunch of prairie flowers placed beside her bed, their stems tied clumsily with twine. And on cold dawns, when the wind hissed through the cracks of the shutters, the girl would press a tin cup of coffee into Margaret's hands before tending to her own chores, as though she feared the stranger might vanish without a tether. Yet outside the ranch, whispers grew sharp. At the mercantile, Margaret felt eyes trail her, Words murmured behind her back. That's the one who was left behind. Someone said too loud for courtesy. Supposed to marry a man down south. He must have thought better of it. Their laughter was low, but Margaret heard it clear. She carried those words back to the ranch, where she folded her shawl tighter around her shoulders and wondered if she bore a mark no one else could see. At night, when the lamp guttered low, her thoughts returned to her first husband. She remembered the weight of his hand, the vows spoken, and then the graveside where she had stood alone. She wondered if love was something destined to betray her, if she were cursed to live as the one who was always left, always unwanted. Thomas spoke little. His eyes carried a distance that told her he lived half his life in places she could not follow. Sometimes she glimpsed him by the window at dusk, his gaze fixed toward the low hill where a lone marker stood. Other times she noticed his jaw tighten when riders passed along the horizon, his hand drifting unconsciously toward the rifle above the mantle. The land itself carried scars-burned posts from old raids, fences mended in haste, a field left fallow too long. He bore the scorn of neighbors. 2 Men at the feed store eyed him with suspicion when Margaret accompanied him into town, muttering about outsiders and women gone astray. Thomas said nothing, but Margaret saw the muscle twitch in his cheek, the way his shoulders squared as though bracing against a blow. She guessed he carried guilt not only for his late wife's grave, but for things he had failed to prevent, things that had carved him into the silent man he was now. The days fell into rhythm. Morning chores, evening silence, nights of restless thought. Margaret swept floors, mended shirts, tended the stove, yet the silence between her and Thomas did not feel like hatred. It was something heavier, something shaped by grief. In the rocking chair that no one dared touch, in the rifle, too polished to be idle, in the tools left to rust. She read the story of a man who carried ghosts, too loud to allow for speech, and though she longed to believe the girl's whispered prayer, Margaret feared the truth that she was but another passing shadow, destined to be cast aside when the house grew weary of her presence. Still, each time she felt despair tighten its hold. She recalled the gentle tug of braids in her hair, the flowers beside her bed, the coffee pressed into her palms at dawn. Small gestures, fragile but real, like threads weaving her into a tapestry she did not yet believe she belonged to. The storm came sudden, like a beast let loose from the mountains. Clouds gathered thick and low, swallowing the last light of day until the prairie turned to shadow. The first drops struck the roof, sharp as pebbles, and within minutes the rain was a hammer, lashing against the shingles and pouring down the windows in sheets. Thunder cracked so near the cabin seemed to tremble in its joints. Margaret had run outside when the first gust arrived, skirts clinging to her legs, shawl already damp as she wrestled linens from the line. The wind tore at her arms, whipping fabric like sails, and by the time she stumbled back inside, clutching the tangled bundle, she was soaked through. Her cheeks glowed with the storm's bite, her breath unsteady. She set about feeding the fire, coaxing reluctant flame into warmth. Drops slid from her hair onto the hearthstones, hissed in the heat. Thomas watched from the table, silent, his scarred face turned toward her in the flicker of lamplight. Something in her brisk determination, her refusal to surrender to the storm's fury, caught him. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered, a quiet admiration he dared not let take form. The night deepened, rain drummed steady, thunder rolled like cannon fire across the plains. Then came the knock, soft, almost drowned by the storm, but clear enough. Margaret froze, her hand on the kettle. Thomas rose, the weight of caution in every step. He opened the door to a figure leaning heavy against the frame, rain streaming down dark braids, blood mingling with water on his arm. An Apache, alone, weary, wounded. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Fear surged, stories she'd heard in town, whispers of raids and violence. She gripped her shawl tight, eyes darting to the rifle above the mantle. But Thomas did not reach for it. He stepped aside, steady and sure. "Come in," he said. The man entered, shoulders sagging with fatigue. Mud clung to his boots, water pooling beneath him. His eyes met Thomas's with recognition, an unspoken history passing between them. Thomas fetched a chair, guided him down without question. Margaret's heart pounded. "You'll bring trouble," she whispered, low enough she thought only herself might hear. But Thomas caught it. He glanced at her, calm yet firm. "He once saved me," he said simply. No more explanation, no defense, just truth spoken plain. Margaret stood by the hearth, torn between fear and curiosity. She watched as Thomas brought clean cloth, as the Apache bared an arm slashed deep by some unknown skirmish. She expected hostility, suspicion, but what she saw instead was trust, settler and native, moving in a rhythm that belonged to old debts, old understandings. Her hands trembled as Thomas asked her for water. She fetched it, setting the basin by his side. The wounded man's gaze flicked to her, unreadable, but not hostile. Something in it reminded her of her own reflection after long journeys, exhausted, worn, but not cruel. The storm pressed hard against the walls, rattling the shutters, howling through the chinks. Inside, another storm raged, fear against compassion, mistrust against duty. Margaret's pulse slowed only when Thomas nodded for her to press cloth against the wound. She hesitated, then did so, her fingers brushing the man's skin, warm, despite the chill. The blood seeped through the cloth, and with it bled something from her as well, the tightness of prejudice. The suspicion drilled by rumor. In lamplight, their three shadows stretched across the wall. Man, woman, stranger bound together by chance, by storm, by necessity. Margaret felt the weight of loneliness shift, not lift, but shift. Kindness, she realized, wore many faces. And sometimes the least familiar carried the greatest truth. When the wound was bound and the man leaned back, weary but stable, Thomas poured him coffee. No words were exchanged, only nods, but it was enough. Outside, the rain softened to a steady murmur, washing dust and old bitterness from the air. Margaret sat by the fire, her damp shawl spread to dry. The storm inside her eased as well, leaving in its place an uneasy calm, a sense that perhaps enemies and allies were not written into the land but chosen, moment by moment. She glanced at Thomas, who sat across the fire from her, the scar on his face stark in the glow. For the first time she wondered what other layers lay hidden beneath his silence, and if she, too, could find shelter in them. The storm left the land raw and cleansed, puddles shining like mirrors in wagon ruts, the sky pale as bleached bone. Life at the ranch slid into a rhythm that seemed almost gentle on its surface. Margaret rose early with Thomas, carrying buckets from the well, while the horizon still wore the blush of dawn. She mended shirts at the table while he split wood in the yard. Together, they fed the stock, her hands scattering grain, while his pitchfork moved steady in the hay. They rarely spoke more than necessity required, yet each silence pressed heavier than words. When she brushed past him in the doorway, when his shadow fell across her sewing, when their hands reached for the same tool, something stirred. Charged and unsaid, it might have been bearable had the world beyond the ranch not intruded. In town, voices sharpened like knives. Women at the church steps whispered just loud enough for her to hear. Abandoned once already. Strange to see her here. Men tipped hats with stiff courtesy, their eyes narrowing when Thomas walked beside her. Margaret bore it with a straight back, but each word sank into her bones. She began to wonder if she truly carried a mark of shame that others saw plainly. One Sunday she sought to defy it. She unfolded the dress she had carried in her satchel since the train ride, a wedding dress meant for another life. Another man. The lace had yellowed, yet it still bore dignity. She wore it to church, shawl draped over her shoulders, hoping not for admiration but for the quiet reclaiming of herself. Instead, the whispers grew crueler. Laughter hid behind him and a girl snickered, pointing. Margaret stood through the service with her head high, but inside she shrank. Each note of the organ a reminder of how far from welcome she truly was. Back at the ranch, she entered the house alone. The rocking chair by the hearth stood waiting, its oak arms polished smooth by years of hands now gone. She sank into it without thinking. The motion startled her back and forth, creak and sway as though she had trespassed into another woman's memory. Tears stung her eyes. She had carried her grief across miles of track only to find it waiting here. Dressed in different shapes, whispering the same truth, she could not outrun sorrow, nor stitch over her widowhood with borrowed lace. The child noticed. She lingered in the doorway, twisting the hem of her dress, her eyes, wide with unspoken fear, fastened on Margaret in the chair. You won't leave, will you? She asked softly, as if the very question might make it so. Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at the girl, this little one who had braided her hair, brought her flowers, offered her coffee in dawn's gray light. She thought of all the prayers the child must have whispered before the train had ever carried her here. I don't want to, Margaret said at last. Her voice wavered, but it was truth. The girl's shoulders eased a little, though she did not smile. She knew as well as Margaret that wanting to stay was not the same as belonging. That evening, Thomas sat, sharpening a blade outside, the scrape of stone on steel carrying into the house. Margaret watched him from the doorway, the firelight behind her stretching her shadow long. He raised his eyes, just once, and their gazes locked. The silence between them no longer felt empty but perilous, as though it might harden into a wall or soften into a bridge. Depending on courage, neither had yet found. She turned back inside, her hand brushing the smooth arm of the rocking chair, and understood, healing would not come from silence alone. If she wanted to remain more than a shadow in this house, she would need to risk being seen, even if it meant rejection all over again. The first signs came in rumor, neighbors speaking of smoke rising from a homestead to the west, of riders seen under moonlight. Families shuttered windows, sharpened blades, and prayed. At the ranch, Thomas listened in silence, his jaw set, though Margaret saw the shadow cross his eyes. She had lived long enough with men to know when danger was near. That night the air lay too still, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. The prairie grass whispered in low waves, and the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls. Margaret lay half wakeful, shawl pulled around her shoulders, when a shout cracked through the dark, and the sound of hooves thundered against the earth. Flames flared sudden at the edge of the yard. Torches, carried high, their fire licking the sky. Shadows of riders swept in, gunshots splitting the silence. The child screamed, rushing to Margaret, who clutched her close, her heart hammering so hard she could scarcely breathe. Thomas was already at the door, rifle in hand. The first volley shattered glass, sending shards across the floor. Margaret froze, paralyzed by the blaze of sound and firelight. Then her eyes shot upward to the mantle. The rifle, polished, waiting. Her breath caught as memory of the church whispers returned abandoned once already. She would not be abandoned again, nor let this house fall while she stood idle. Her hands shook as she reached for it, the weight unfamiliar but solid. She pressed the child into the corner, then stepped to Thomas's side. He glanced at her, surprise flickering, but did not protest. He only nodded, brief and sharp, as if in that moment he saw her not as burden but as equal. The world narrowed to smoke and fire. Gunpowder burned her throat. Torches hissed as rain of sparks fell into the yard. Thomas fired from the doorway, his face cut by flame glow, jaw streaked with blood where glass had grazed him. Margaret raised the rifle, bracing it against her shoulder as he had once shown his daughter with a toy bow. She aimed into the blur of riders. Her shot rang out, deafening, sending one figure toppling from the saddle. Fear roared in her chest, yet alongside it came something fierce, alive. The child's cries drove her forward, her trembling steadied by need stronger than terror. Side by side she and Thomas fired, reloaded, fired again. Sparks lit her shawl at the edge, smoke curling the fringe. She beat it down with her hand, skin burning, but did not falter. The attackers circled, shouting, their torches dying one by one under the storm of bullets. At last, they broke, retreating into the night, hooves fading into the horizon. Silence fell hard, broken only by the crackle of burning fence posts and the ragged sound of breathing. Margaret lowered the rifle. Her hands were raw, her shawl scorched. Thomas set his weapon aside and turned to her, his face streaked with soot, eyes alight, not with victory but with something unspoken. She staggered, and he caught her arm, steadying her. In that grasp lay more than gratitude, it was recognition. It was confession, wordless but clear. The child threw herself into their arms, clinging with all her strength. You stayed, she whispered to Margaret, tears streaking her face. You stayed. When dawn crept over the prairie, the yard lay in ruined scorched posts, trampled earth, smoke curling like ghosts into the pale sky. Thomas sat on the step, cradling Margaret's burned hand in his own. He cleaned it gently, wrapping it with cloth, his rough fingers moving as though every touch were apology and promise at once. Margaret watched him, eyes stinging, not from pain but from the flood of something deeper. She was no longer the woman abandoned at a wrong station, no longer merely a stranger in another's house. She had fought, bled, endured, and in the fire she had found not only her strength but her place. Thomas lifted his gaze, their eyes meeting over the bandaged hand. He said nothing, but he did not need to. Between them, in the hush of morning, lay a devotion born not of chance but of the fire they had survived together. Snow still clung to the edges of the fields when the word came, carried first by a ranch hand, then by whispers at the well, then by the sharp-tongued women in town. The man who had once sent for Margaret had finally come, days too late, bitter with embarrassment, red-faced with pride. He had ridden into town declaring she was his by right, that she had mistaken her stop, that she would return with him by the time Thomas brought the wagon into town. The air was thick with curiosity. Neighbors crowded porches, leaning on rails, waiting for the spectacle. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Gossip had fattened on Margaret since the day she arrived, and now it sharpened its teeth, ready to watch her humiliated once again. Margaret stepped down from the wagon, her hand brushing against Thomas's daughter's for steadiness. The girl squeezed tightly, as though afraid Margaret might vanish if she let go. Margaret's heart pounded not for the man who waited by the hitching post, but for the truth she knew she must face. The man her so-called groom stood stiffly, his coat too fine for the dust of the street, his mustache waxed, his pride brittle as glass. You belong with me, he said, his voice raised for all to hear. You were meant to be my wife. Whatever mistake was made, it ends here. Margaret's fingers tightened around the bundle she carried. The wedding dress, once white, now creased and dulled from its time in a trunk, from the night she had dared wear it in church to prove herself. She lifted it slowly, the fabric catching in the cold wind, fluttering like the ghost of a promise never kept. The crowd hushed. She looked at the dress, then at him, and at last, at Thomas standing steady, his hat brim shadowing his eyes, his daughter pressed close to his side. She saw in them, not ownership but waiting, not command but choice. Her silence stretched, heavier than words. Then, with calm hands, Margaret laid the dress over the hitching rail, as if setting down the weight of an old life. No, she said softly, though her voice carried in the stillness. I will not go with you. A ripple ran through the crowd-shocked murmurs. Sharp intakes of breath, some in scandal, some in admiration. The man's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her stillness struck him harder than any shout could have. His bluster faltered. He turned from her with a curse, mounted his horse, and rode away, his pride trailing like smoke behind him. Margaret did not watch him go. She turned instead to Thomas and the girl. No vows were spoken, no declarations made. She simply moved to Thomas's horse, rested her hand on the saddle, and with his steady arm guiding her, climbed up, her shawl, singed at the edges from the fire, lifted in the wind like a banner, frayed but unbroken. The three of them rode out together. Past the stairs and the whispers, past the church bell that tolled faintly in the distance, snow began to fall, soft at first, then thick, veiling the ruts in the road, softening the harsh outlines of the town. Each flake felt like a covering, not erasing the past but gentling it. On the trail home, Margaret held the girl close before her on the saddle. Thomas rode beside them, silent, his presence as steady as the rhythm of the horse beneath them. She did not think of herself as rescued, nor as stolen. She thought only of how the land looked under snow transformed, yet still itself. Her heart ached with memory of all she had lost, yet it beat steadier now, no longer chained to rejection. Healing, she realized, was not sudden. It was slow as mending a shawl, thread by thread, patient as braiding hair in the morning, quiet as the warmth of a fire tended through long nights. By the time the ranch came into sight, snow had laid its hush across the world. Margaret knew she was not free from sorrow, nor safe from hardship, but she had chosen, and in that choice found her dignity restored. She no longer carried the weight of being unwanted. She carried instead the fragile, precious weight of belonging. The rocking chair still waited by the hearth. The rifle still hung above the mantle. The ghosts would remain. But so too would she. And as the snow fell thicker, Margaret let herself believe quietly, without grandeur, that a second chance could be enough.